Hey, Sarah, how's it going?
Going pretty well. How are you?
Doing fine, doing fine. So we have Sarah Catanzaro from Amplify Partners on the Data Nerd Herd. So for people who don't know who you are, maybe you can give a quick intro about yourself.
Absolutely. So I'm a partner at Amplify Partners. We're an early stage venture capital firm, but we focus specifically on investing in founders who are building technical tools and platforms. My focus area specifically is data and ML tools and platforms, but really that ranges from databases through compute and analytics engines all the way up the stack to BI, experimentation, AutoML tools.
That's quite the range. So, how did you find yourself in the data space starting out?
Huh. It's an interesting story that I think is like very much driven by chance. When I was in college, I studied statistics, but I was in school when the kind of last downturn really happened. And so I initially thought I was going to go into like finance or banking or one of these kind of like more mathematics driven domains. But I saw all of my like friends have their offers pulled by Bear Stearns and other investment banks and thought like, okay, if that's going to happen to me, I might as well just study something else that I'm super interested in. So I decided to double major in statistics and international relations. And as you probably can imagine, like graduating during a downturn with kind of this like weird hodgepodge of degrees, there weren't many like obvious choices for what field I would go into. This is before like data science really became popular. But fortunately, I found a role at a small military think tank focused on creating computational models of insurgencies and other types of adversary behavior. Did that for a while, ended up doing data mining at a larger defense contractor before finding my way to Palantir. And like up until that point, I'd say again, like data science wasn't really a role. What I knew how to do was statistics and applying statistics to data. But I think, over that course of that time, companies became more and more interested in collecting, storing data, and ultimately like using it to drive decision making. So during my tenure at Palantir, data science did start to really emerge as a field, and at some point I wanted to go into earlier stage tech. I called a friend and basically said, like, I know how to do things with data. Where should I go work? And he suggested meeting with Danielle Morrill at Mattermark. I actually went in for a product manager interview because I didn't know enough about like the tech and startup community to determine like what one does with background in data. But fortunately, I think like they were able to like more accurately assess my skill set and offered me a job as their head of data, building out the data science, analytics, ML engineering, those teams and capabilities.
That's really cool. It sounds like our paths are actually pretty similar. Like technical background that was in math and stats as well, and got a job in analytics at a time when like definitely wasn't called data science. When I was in it, it was like you're thrown into like a back office, kind of like that guy in Office Space, Milton, I think. Yeah, and it's interesting. Very circuitous as well. So I totally, I think empathize with your, wanderings and that. And also a big fan of Mattermark too. I actually used to read a lot of the stuff you guys would put out. Thought it was excellent data. So props for that. It's cool.
Yeah, it was cool at Mattermark to be able to work on data to inform the product as well as like data as a product. I think like the ways that you approach building a data science and data team like writ large are somewhat different given those two types of use cases. But certainly I think like when data is your product, there's a little bit more kind of organizational momentum around like making data a center of excellence.
Mm-hmm. I mean, walk me through that real quick. You started at Mattermark. I mean, was there a playbook that you used to, get the data team and data ops up and running, or what was that whole process like?
Oh my gosh, it was like kind of terrifying at the time. I had never managed a team before. Pretty much nobody else had really ever managed a data science team before. So there weren't really any standards on like how to grow the team or how to manage the team or how to think about like driving organizational impact. I think, one of the things that I do in nearly any new role is just try to like take stock of the resources, challenges, and opportunities that are available to you. And ultimately, I think like a lot of the work that I did in my first couple of months at Mattermark ended up driving the work that we continue to do for the next like 2.5, 3 years. So, I mean, for example, I think one of the first things that I worked on was essentially a data quality scorecard such that like we could understand not just our current state of data quality, but how certain investments in engineering, in data mining, in machine learning were actually improving data quality. One of the things, again, which made it easier to take that action and drive an investment in data quality was the fact that, again, we were a data vendor. So people kind of clearly understood that improvements in data quality would enable our sales team to win deals in bake-offs. Without that structure, I think like that could have been a bigger challenge. It would have been a more complex ROI use case.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you bring up an interesting point too. So I think around the time you're starting there and building out all these things, I mean, there just weren't a lot of good resources, I don't think, to like from either a tech perspective or a best practices perspective. I mean, how did you go about figuring out all this, like everything that you had to do?
I think it was just talking to a lot of people and creating, again, these artifacts like a data quality scorecard that could help drive decision making.
Yeah.
Coming from the defense and intelligence sector, I tend to really like process and structure, probably more so than other people. I think one of the kind of ideas or philosophies in the military is this concept of like command and control. So the general idea is that like if you have a grand strategy and you have that strategy specified as a set of strategic objectives and key operations, it enables people to make tactical decisions in the face of dynamic environments and limited communications with others among their team. Since you have kind of these standards by which to like gauge decision outcomes. And so I think one of the things that I did early on at Mattermark is kind of commit my team to a set of OKRs. Those OKRs became kind of instrumental in determining who we should hire, who we should promote, how we thought about like making progress, how we thought about our various investments. So I do kind of like this idea of thinking about like your strategic objectives and allowing everything from technical decisions to organizational decisions to kind of trickle down from that set of strategic objectives.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's also like such a it's different too than maybe some other management philosophies in the tech industry, right? Where it's sort of on one hand, there's definitely, I think, the strategic objective focus. On the other hand, there's almost the exact opposite, which is just kind of kumbaya, like let's all individually figure things out and we'll somehow figure it out. So have you seen, I guess, to kind of loop it into, the role you're in now, with your companies and I guess more broadly in the tech industry, are there certain, I guess, management or strategic approaches that you're finding work better than others?
Yeah, I think I still am a big supporter of kind of aligning a company, a startup around like a set of strategic milestones. I think it's important both for, again, like decision-making in the face of uncertainty, but also important as like a key motivator. I think one of the things that was like the biggest struggle for me in my role at Mattermark was that I was managing people, some of whom were data scientists, some of whom were data analysts, and they also faced a lot of ambiguity. Like as a data analyst, data scientist in 2014, like what is my career path? How do I, articulate to other people in the organization what I'm doing? But I think many, if not all of the people on my team were really motivated by impact and aligning on a set of strategic milestones. It enabled them to like really both understand for themselves as well as to kind of express and show to others how they were driving impact. And so that's something that I think is really important in working with portfolio companies today. It's understanding what our strategic milestones are, aligning on those so that we know that like our vision, the founder's vision is one that we clearly understand and that we've synthesized that vision in the way that was intended. I think it matters a lot for both organization as well as motivation.
And so, I guess given the inherent uncertainty in startups, like how much should you balance the strategic milestones versus inevitably the uncertainty that comes about just as you're going about the day-to-days of your business?
Yeah, so I think it is really important to consider how you frame your strategic milestones. Like for some of our portfolio companies, the strategic milestone is like ask and answer the right set of questions. And I think by framing kind of the asking and answering a set of questions as a strategic milestone, it enables you to kind of account for that uncertainty and ambiguity. I think there is also something about understanding like when the right time to focus on progress and align that progress with milestones is. Like for a lot of companies, like progress is unclear. Like maybe setting milestones is not the right approach because you don't know what A is and you don't know what Z is. So why would you try to infer what like B or D might be? We have this expression, and I don't know where it came from, but like throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks. I think early on in the life cycle of many companies, like what you're optimizing for is not necessarily progress, but just like knowledge, understanding, learning. And the best way to do that can just be like, we're going to try a lot of things and see what works. And then once we know what works, we'll kind of specify this path to get from there to our broader vision.
So you're just finding that spaghetti sticks on a wall period could be a milestone. And it's right?
Yeah, exactly.
So, that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, it's something that I see quite often with companies, especially startups. It seems like inevitably the business model is either figured out or you kind of like go do something else, or there's inevitable pivots, right? I can't think of like a single company that I've seen where it's been like, we're going from A to Z, and like that's totally what happened the entire trip, right? But something might happen. I might not be aware of those companies, but it's interesting.
Yeah, I think that's why it's also important to like treat those milestones as something that evolves as you learn more. sometimes you might have a strategic milestone related to sales, for example, and you realize that like what is really important is like building a community. Committing to that strategic milestone around sales is just silly. Like you have new information, you need to update that. And I think that's another way in which you kind of incorporate this uncertainty and flexibility to enable growth, but not just kind of like unconstrained and random growth within a startup.
Switching gears a bit, I want to get your take on this. So I'm sure you've seen these graphics before, where it shows the number of companies in 1 year in a sector, say data products, and then fast forward a number of years, and that the number of companies has exploded. What are your thoughts on the I guess how as an investor, how do you think about identifying winners in the data tooling space with such a large number of companies and just intense competition right now?
Yeah. So I'd start off by saying that like I am not a strong believer in end-to-end products or end-to-end platforms, particularly in the data space. I think end-to-end platforms can be beneficial when a domain is just starting out. And like potential customers really just need a solution in a box. But I think we've kind of passed that juncture for data tools and platforms, possibly even for ML tools and platforms. And so I think much more about identifying those startups that can own an important part of the data or ML lifecycle. That really means, I think, two things. It means identifying kind of the right wedge into the workflow. So identifying like the right specific problem that you can solve that can kind of drive growth. But then also identifying what's next. So you have a wedge in. What is the adjacent or orthogonal part of the workflow that you can then own? An example might be DBT. So with DBT, they started out solving this really acute problem around data modeling, enabling dimensional modeling within the data warehouse such that like people could create core data tables that their internal customers could use. That solved a kind of hair on fire problem, if you will. But from there, it was natural to kind of expand into like documentation and testing. So we look for things like that, where you're solving an important problem, but there's a logical place to go next.
Yeah, that's interesting too. Especially, I mean, because it's interesting in the context of the end-to-end discussion that you just had too, where it's like, on one hand, it's you're solving obviously DBT started as kind of scratching their own itch, right? And then it's what's next. But then, at some point, does DBT end up being an end-to-end tool of sorts too, several years down the road?
Yeah. I mean, I think like this is where like there's an interesting game theory component, because like other data tools and platforms companies will start in other places and they're doing the same thing, identifying other parts of the workflow that they can own. And so like ultimately a lot of these companies will converge. I think there will be some consolidation, but I think that like the data workflow is also extensive enough such that some companies can own swaths of it without owning the entire end-to-end workflow. And
sorry, what was that?
I think it also maps to roles too. It's hard to build a tool that is really, really, really awesome for data analysts and data scientists and data engineers and software engineers. And since like different aspects of the data lifecycle will be owned by different roles and stakeholders too, I think that'll also kind of create natural division in what would otherwise be an end-to-end platform.
Yeah. I think it also comes down to like simple positioning arguments too, right? Like you can really like occupy like one thing, maybe one and a half things in people's minds. So, I mean, it's interesting in the sense where there will probably be this like kind of overlap with all these different tools, but in one niche, like there's, the top tool, and it sort of leads into another niche where there's another top tool. And so I guess in between the workflows, maybe you can choose one or the other or the best of breed. We see that often, with a lot of our clients. Like, it's interesting too, just seeing kind of the hodgepodge of stuff that's sort of mixed together, like DBT coexisting with like Matillion, for example. That happens, right? And it's just interesting because it's almost like these micro niches of like best tool for the job. And when I say the job, I mean like that specific task that they have to get done, right? So
yeah. I mean, I think the thing that is very cool that's happening in the data ecosystem, but maybe not the ML ecosystem to the same extent yet, is that like vendors are kind of partnering together so that they can offer their customers end-to-end functionality, but with like best of breed products. You see that with, for example, like DBT and Looker. There's some like intersection between like LookML and DBT, but I think, the DBT and Looker teams have really figured out how these tools work great together, such that, you can create these BI dashboards based on your core data tables. I see more and more and more of that in the data space, whereas ML, I think like people are just starting to experiment with like what are the boundaries of various tools and how do they integrate together.
Yeah. I won't name companies, but I sense like the ML space is almost like, it reminds me of sort of how talented Informatica were actually back in the day, like these really monolithic tools. And that's sort of what you see with maybe some of the incumbents who I won't name. But it reminds me a lot of that and what happened to the talents and Informaticas of the world. I mean, we're talking about it right now. It all got unbundled, right, in a pretty massive way, to the point now where, you can make a compelling, like, great pipeline, just piecing together these various core components and swap them out for if something better comes along. Not that big of a deal. Just pop that out and put the better one in. So that's kind of cool.
Yeah, but absolutely. I mean, I think there's some notion of solving specific problems in the ML space, but the positioning is still confusing. Like so many of these ML tools are positioning themselves as ML platforms. And in a relatively new field where, to the conversation about Mattermark, the organizational standards, the technical standards they're still in flux. I just think it's really, really hard to build something that is a best of breed end-to-end platform today, let alone like a best of breed end-to-end platform for the next 5-10 years.
Right. We have a common friend. Josh Tobin's talk that he gave at Utah Data Engineering Meetup. I think that's a really good example, right? Like a lot of this stuff is still being fleshed out in a lot of cases and shown for the first time in an evaluation store. I don't recall ever hearing about that before. And it just seems like even a lot of the new technologies coming out, things like feature stores, that's suddenly now a thing that everyone's talking about. And yeah, you can't even. There's nobody who could, I think, convince me personally that the ML space is like it's all settled and done, and we know everything we need to know about doing ML. Like, I thought I knew everything there was to know about ML back like 10, 11 years ago, and I don't know anything actually. And in fact, it's almost worse. I feel like I know less these days because there's just the more you know, I think the more you find you don't know actually. So.
Yeah, I feel exactly the same way. Like the ML field is evolving like very quickly. Things transition from like research into industry, perhaps sometimes like too rapidly without like really understanding the full technical, ethical, product implications. I think another thing that just isn't very clear yet is like what the confluence of data and analytics and ML will be. I had a conversation with a friend this morning, for example, about like feature stores. and what the difference or what the relationship between like a feature store and a metrics repository should be. In some senses, like they're the same thing. There may be like slight differences in the features associated with them.
Yeah.
But to me, like that is almost one of the biggest question marks, including on like how you find the right wedge, where you move orthogonally, and how you ultimately build a big company. Will ML and analytics stacks evolve separately, or will they start to converge? And what might the timeline be for that? I just don't know.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thread. Those are good points, and it reminds me of this thread that I have with my partner all the time, where it's I feel like software engineering as well is converging with data engineering. I suspect in 5 years, whatever made up number I want to give it, like the difference of a data engineer and a software engineer, I think that's just rapidly declining, because your apps need to have some sort of analytics and ML component, and that you need to pipe it in. But then I was looking at even something as benign as Firebase the other day, just for some dorking around, because I like to do that. And I noticed, okay, this is kind of cool. It has analytics built in. It feeds into ML. Geez, what else does this thing do? A lot, actually. You can push data like anywhere you want in the GCP ecosystem, and that's kind of cool. So,
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think like that kind of pattern that you described is like really playing out along streaming data now, because like Kafka, it was a message bus. So it like kind of started off more as like, well, it started off as a developer tool. But now you see like these tools emerging, like Materialize, that are treating streams as a substrate upon which you can build analytics and data tools and applications. So you have like streaming at this kind of interesting intersection between like software engineering, data engineering, analytics, and powering online ML systems too.
What are your thoughts on the, I guess, the present and future of streaming?
So idealistically, like I'm of the viewpoint that like streaming is kind of the right abstraction for data. Or streams are the right abstraction for data. Data is a representation of the world. I mean, data is basically a model of the world, if you will, and the world is dynamic. So shouldn't, our abstraction be dynamic? I don't really see a reason why we need batch if streams are available and accessible. I think the problem that I see today, and again, I say like streams are the right abstraction idealistically, is that like streaming data is really hard to use. So it's like too much complexity for several use cases. I sometimes hear companies say like, oh, we want to build a real-time dashboard leveraging streams. Like, do you really need a real-time dashboard? Like, that's going to be hard. Does it matter so much that you see your sales changing every couple of milliseconds even? Batch is probably good enough, but that's just because streaming is hard. Like, if streaming data becomes as easy to use as Fivetran plus Snowflake plus dbt, then I see no reason why like everything shouldn't be a stream.
Yeah, when I used to work at this IoT startup, and people would ask for reports, these real-time reports. Like, so what are you going to do with that? The data comes in, you see a graph, more data comes in the next second. Like, what action are you going to do on that? And it's like, well, wouldn't it be better if I just automate this action that you were going to take and then just give you a report on what happened? And so I don't know about you, but that's how I think about, because you bring up, I think, a really good point where streaming data that's just how life is. Things are streaming. There's not a sense of like boundedness with time. It just flows. And I feel the same way about the utilization of this data too, where BI systems, I think, they're good, but like charts are sort of an abstraction in a lot of ways. And if you look at the world, I mean, besides what humans do, I mean, you don't see animals making charts, right? But, you know, things happen sort of organically in the world where, you know, information, whatever you want to call it, like it has impact on things and chain reactions happen. And I think like event-driven systems that just, you know, have automated actions, whether that's AI or just even heuristics, like the world I want to live in is just where those things just happen. And I just go about my merry day, not even having to look at a screen. So, but that's wishful thinking and will probably never happen. So
absolutely. I mean, I think that is like one of the most exciting applications of streaming, that we can move from like intelligence into automation. And I love, you know, the example that you gave too, like animals don't make charts. I think like in many ways, like our decision making is in batch mode right now. Like we wait for a certain amount of information to accumulate. We synthesize that information and analyze that information and make a decision based on that batch. And I think one of the kind of powers of computation is that like human decision making may be batch based on streams, but like we can move beyond that. I often use the term machine intelligence instead of AI. We can move beyond that, including through automation.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because you know, it's still early days in the streaming world too. Like I don't think that there's just like in ML, we're talking about, you know, just best practices and whatnot. It's still, I think streaming is just, it remains to be seen, because most of the companies out there are just still in batch mode. I can make an argument that a lot of companies are barely in batch mode. I don't know what I don't know what the step is below batch, but whatever that is, like it's a lot of the companies that I deal with, I know are, you know, they're just, you know, a lot of these companies are just now trying to figure out data warehousing, modern data warehousing, that is, right? And so it's interesting too, just because there's this huge race going on, you know, at the extreme end of things, where you get a lot of bright people working on, you know, just the most modern cutting edge data tooling and ML tooling out there. Then there's sort of the rest of the world that will eventually catch up, in theory, and adopt these tools. So when you're working with your portfolio companies, I guess, where do they, is there like a type of customer they tend to deal with? Are they more kind of tech savvy, or kind of old school companies, or is there a mix? How does that work?
So I'd say it certainly tends to be a mix. I think one of the kind of key challenges that data tool builders face today is you know, a stakeholder management problem. I wish I could say that like our portfolio companies sell to data engineers at pre-IPO companies. I wish I could even say like our portfolio companies sell to data engineers, but I think like there's so many different roles and so many stakeholders involved in decision making around data infrastructure, that ultimately a portfolio company that we may have, for example, that's building a tool to transform notebooks into data stories and applications. Their user might be the data scientist, but they also need to kind of understand what is the appeal, what is the message and positioning for the business user who's going to consume that data application. What is the appeal for, you know, the data engineer who's perhaps weaving notebooks into the broader data platform? What is the appeal for the data analyst who is, you know, transitioning from SQL to Python, and how do you build both, you know, new product features and a narrative accordingly to best serve all of those personas?
That is a dilemma, isn't it?
I mean, I think the best tools, though, are those that kind of streamline the interactions and create an interface such that like different stakeholders can really collaborate most effectively. There's some magic there where you build a tool that solves a specific problem, for one stakeholder really well, but creates kind of the right interfaces, the right ecosystem, such that like that stakeholder can really collaborate and interface with their peers more effectively. And their peers can kind of interface with this platform and interface with the primary stakeholder in a way that feels like native and intuitive to them.
Worry about it. I mean, that's interesting though. I mean, so, I mean, are you talking kind of like flywheel effects in a way with a product?
I think
or?
that stickiness, I think, enables flywheel effects. But I think like what I'm really describing is just, I'm blanking out on who wrote this article, but it was on like this concept of like ladders of abstraction. In many ways, I actually think like Excel is like the perfect example of like ladders of abstraction. The business user can open Excel and without like really understanding anything aside from the most basic formulas, actually without even understanding basic formulas, they can kind of glean insights from an Excel spreadsheet. The more advanced user who knows how to write formulas in Excel, like they can manipulate data in Excel in a more complex way, such that they can create something that is presentable and easily consumable to that business user. The most advanced user can write VBA such that like they are creating much more complex operations within the spreadsheet. So you have like these different abstractions that are well suited to different types of users, but also enable them to kind of collaborate most effectively.
And I guess when you're evaluating a company, are those levels of abstraction something that you evaluate up front, or do you evaluate maybe the potential to have these level of abstractions?
I think what we evaluate is both the potential to have these ladders of abstraction, but also like the founder's awareness that they may need these ladders of abstraction. If I find a founder and they're like, okay, I'm building, this ML framework, and all I need to worry about is that like this is a great tool for a specific type of ML engineering persona, like that to me is at least a yellow flag. I think there needs to be some awareness that in the data space, there are multiple stakeholders. There are multiple people who are kind of affected by tools and platforms. And so while, again, focusing initially on a specific problem for a specific person is the right thing to do from like a product and engineering perspective, you need to formulate hypotheses on how you can engage these other stakeholders and like how you can create these interfaces such that organizations really benefit from your tool, not just data tools or data teams or data practitioners.
That's interesting. And I guess, are there any resources or suggestions for founders, especially technical founders, to sort of, I guess, begin understanding this? I can't imagine this is the most intuitive thing to figure out as you're writing like your open source project and thinking sort of in 4D chess almost about where this thing's going to go.
Yeah, I think there's a great blog that First Round put out a couple of years ago. I think like the title of the blog post is something like "Get on the Wagon." The idea being essentially that like entire teams need to get on the wagon and have as many conversations as possible with kind of a diverse range of stakeholders. I obviously am coming from data science and statistics background, but I really like this kind of scientific approach to defining hypotheses about different stakeholders, running experiments, including through some of these conversations and user research, developing conclusions, and then returning to create new hypotheses. There is nothing that really replaces just talking to people. And people like talking about their problems. So for technical founders, for business founders, just getting, I was about to say getting coffee with people, but I guess getting on a Zoom and just listening to people talk about their problems and like listen, don't talk. I think, that is probably the best way to kind of understand varying interests, where they intersect, where they diverge, and how you can create a tool that really marries, unifies, and satisfies all of these interests.
And that's good advice. And what's your impression on once a startup is going, like how much should they still be out there talking to people to get new information that might help influence the direction of the product or the company?
Oh, I think this is like a never-ending process, particularly with data tools and platforms today. I think we're seeing more and more that this like consumerization of the enterprise, where so many tools are adopted, bottoms up, and users are expecting not just enterprise value, but also like delightful experiences. Community becomes everything, and you don't just satisfy your community by building the right thing at first. You need to kind of continue to listen and interact and teach your community.
Makes a lot of sense. Then you hit on the word community. This is something I'm starting to see more and more, maybe you are too, but I mean, what is the importance of building a community around your product, or more broadly, sort of the niche that you're in?
So I think, community matters in many respects. I think I talked before a little bit about like partnerships and how data tool builders can partner with other vendors such that they can build the best end-to-end solution, but composed of unique parts. That's one aspect of community. I think another aspect of community is enabling people within your ecosystem, enabling your users to help each other. In some ways, like it almost replaces some of the aspects of like customer success or account management, or like relieves that burden from the company. People who are using your tool every day are going to learn the best ways to use your tool, and creating kind of this knowledge flywheel, knowledge sharing through community, I think is so important. Community is also a very effective way to glean information and to test hypotheses. Like it's tough. Like you can't, very easily have 10 user calls in a day and then spend the next like 10 hours building and then sleep for 4 hours for 7 years. So using your community as more of a forum where people will articulate like what they need, where they'll naturally like converge around these needs. I think it's a very effective way of kind of learning what the customer wants.
Mm-hmm. I guess on that note too, I mean, do you have an opinion on whether a data tool startup should focus on being an open source model, or maybe just keeping it closed source? So maybe an example is dbt, which is open source, versus Snowflake, which is essentially a kind of walled garden.
Yeah, that's something that I've been thinking about a lot lately, including like open source in the context of what is happening in the world around the pandemic, in the context of like different political climates. I don't think there's a right answer. Like, I'm not one of those people who believe strongly that all software or all data tools should be open source. I think oftentimes I see a couple of things conflated. There's a question of, should you be using GitHub as a marketing and distribution channel? And I think GitHub has become an increasingly powerful marketing and distribution channel, particularly for developers, but also increasingly for data engineers and data scientists. Then there's a question of, should you offer something for free? And I think, with many of these trends related to the consumerization of the enterprise, bottoms up adoption, having a low cost or no cost way for somebody to try something out is important. Then there's the question of, should people have visibility into the code base? It doesn't matter that my user, my customer can actually read my code. And then maybe I forgot this before, but like another question of, governance, like should they be able to impact or change the code base? Should it be extensible in that way? And the answer to all of those questions will not be yes for every company. I think like in many ways, like you don't need to be able to extend Snowflake. You want to be able to build upon Snowflake. So having a proprietary platform makes sense. And arguably, like if you're building a cloud data warehouse like Snowflake, you may not want other users to be able to kind of change the code base and modify it in ways which you don't have control, or have more limited control. So I think companies shouldn't rush into open source without kind of understanding the full implications of open source. Open source does not just mean free, and it doesn't just mean like on GitHub.
Yeah, we see this with a lot of our partners who I think kind of have the dual model of open source, and then they're trying to form a company around this, right? And the successful ones are raising money, but what we find is there's still a lot of contention where a client may buy or may just use the open source version, right? Whether they install it themselves or the one provided by one of the big three clouds, it just happens to be on like a VM that's there, right? And so then the salesperson for this startup has to come in and say, well, but our managed system, which costs a lot of money, is obviously worth a lot more than the free version you're using now. And it definitely forces some pretty interesting machinations, I would say, with the startup in terms of the story and the pricing model and marketing messaging and everything else around it, because you're essentially competing with yourself at the end of the day, and at least in these cases here. And obviously it works for some companies. I know that with DBT, their emphasis is on like, look, we don't really care if you're using the paid or the free version. We just want to get adoption. At least it's the last time I talked to them. And so I think that's a pretty cool model, because at the end of the day, if the focus is just on a land grab opportunity, then go grab land. I mean, I don't really care how you do it. So I guess the money will happen, hopefully follow later. But, whereas you contrast that with Snowflake, for example, I mean, from day one, I remember these guys were on the scene and they were knocking on doors, and it was just a much different model than, say, probably Spark and Databricks, right? Which is very, they're doing really well too. So, but Snowflake's model, I think just almost every aspect of it was just different than you'd find with an open source company. Like, I think in terms of every checkbox that you just proposed. So, but it obviously works, especially when you compare Databricks and Snowflake together. It's like both are hugely successful, and I think, both are going to be great public companies. So,
Absolutely. I mean, I think open source works probably most effectively when you're thinking about like category creation, when you can deliver something to the open source community that solves a hard problem that has not yet been solved. And so it creates value in having any solution. But if you want, the bells and whistles around the solution, if you want it to be easy, not just solved, there is a commercial platform around it. There are certainly like other open source business models aside from open core that have worked and have been demonstrated by like various companies ranging from like Hashi to Elastic. But I think, again, it comes down to being deliberate about like what is the value of open source, and what are some hypotheses I have about creating additional value beyond like just what gets delivered through the open source offering.
Makes sense. So where do you see the data tooling space going in the next 5 years?
That's a good question. Certainly, I think like we are at a point in time where there are a lot of point solutions. And I think there will increasingly be consolidation among those point solutions. As I said, everybody is solving a problem, but also using that as their wedge into a broader workflow. They will kind of end up clashing. And my expectation is that there will be consolidation. As I mentioned also, I think a key question for me is like, will that consolidation also occur across the analytics and ML or Python and SQL stacks? I think we've started to get a lot better at understanding how data science yields organizational value. And I think we'll see some of those use cases ranging from product analytics to understand phenomena like churn in funnels to experimentation really scaled out and advanced. It amazes me to see what some of the big tech companies are doing with regards to experimentation. I was talking to someone at Kareem, and they're using contextual bandits to essentially like do feature selection more or less like on the fly, which is just crazy to think about. I think we still need to identify like the killer use cases for ML, and the identification of the killer use cases for ML, including beyond search and recommendation, will drive a lot of the development in the ML ops and ML infra space. But without kind of that clarity around like how do we turn ML systems into business value, it will be difficult to define the right tools. In that vein, I do believe that like the best ML tools will be those that are like human-centric and business-centric versus more tech-centric. So that's a couple of ideas. I think the streaming phenomena will also play out in material ways in the coming years too.
Yeah, I think those are all good insights. Yeah, we'll have to touch base on a constant basis to see where this goes. Like you, I'm really bullish on streaming. I think that that's going to unlock a lot of potential, especially in the ML space, where right now, because a lot of it is just inherently batch oriented, you're kind of hamstrung, but that's going to change a lot. And no idea where it goes.
Yeah. Yep. Cool. Yeah. I think that's a perfect example of what I was trying to describe, where like once we see that business value, organizational value lies in online ML systems, I think there'll be more investment in a streaming infrastructure for machine learning.
Yeah, definitely. Well, cool. I think it's probably a good place to stop. So coming up on time, but as always, love chatting with you, and thanks for being on the Data Nerd Herd. So for people who want to learn more about you, where can they get more information?
So you can certainly connect with me on Twitter. I'm Sarah, SARAH, Cat, CAT21. And most of my contact information, bio, et cetera, is on the Amplify website.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thanks, Sarah. And we'll hope to have you on again. So thanks a lot.
Awesome.